I'm excited to be here tonight to answer your questions.
Okay, also, Rob, if for those of you who know, he is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he is also the founder and CEO of Yes. And so we will talk more about that if you need to, but otherwise we're going to go right on into the questions. The first question we've got is, this is the longest I've been sober. I want to know, will I most likely relapse if I don't have an accountability partner?
That's a great question. No, not necessarily. The fact is you've gotten into a place of sobriety because you've put in the work. You've obviously gone through kind of a mindset change, and you've learned about what it takes. There's motivation there that's really working for you. The key is accountability. I've known individuals who have accountability partners who they're not the right kind of an accountability partner. In choosing an accountability partner, you really want to find someone that doesn't transfer their stuff onto you. So, for example, if you're talking with an accountability partner, trying to really find that connection and be able to be honest and accountable with all your stuff, and they start going into all of their issues, it can be counterproductive. So you want to be careful in choosing an accountability partner, and to find a really solid one can sometimes take time. It can often be an ecclesiastical leader. For some, it's a spouse. For some, it's a great friend, and they understand that they're there to be a sounding board. But that doesn't mean that just because you don't have one that you're going to relapse. What that means for you is you need to find ways to be accountable. First off, to be accountable to yourself. Are you allowing yourself to justify small behaviors? If you start saying it's not that bad, then that's your limbic system, that part of your brain where the addiction is housed, that's it trying to sneak its way back in. So the first rule of thumb is when someone is really surrendered, and taken on that goal for sobriety, they get to that place where they're being accountable to themselves and then accountable to others when there is that opportunity. Sharing your vulnerable places, sharing the honest conversations about this addiction with someone who will not empathize with you, who will talk about their own stuff, who doesn't, create that healthy emotional connection, can sometimes be more harm than good. So finding a really solid individual to be accountable to is sometimes a journey, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen for long-term sobriety to happen. But being accountable is super important. So if it's like, I have an accountability partner, but I'm not being honest with my spouse, that's where things can get really tricky. So anyone who's married needs to be really working on that relationship, and it's not easy all the time, but to get to the point where they can be accountable to a spouse in healthy ways. Not talking about every single time you have a thought, it could be really not healthy, but learning that path and pattern, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more tonight as well.
I don't understand why I feel like I'm embedded in negativity and pessimism. Is it possible to have control over my sex drive? Is it possible to go on for 6-7 months without having a single orgasm?
Well, that's kind of a trick question, right? Because I'm actually a professor at a university, and I teach human sexuality. And the fact is we are sexual beings by nature. Your body, especially the male sexual response cycle, is that you will orgasm. Meaning, if you're not masturbating, if you're not looking at pornography and masturbating, then the likelihood is that you will have nocturnal emissions or wet dreams. And that's very much normal for the body to go through that process. So if your body does get to a point where it's like, you know what, I'm going to orgasm one way or another, it usually does that in the night, in the dream, in the REM state.
It always helps me to hear success stories. Is there one you can share about someone who is strong in recovery that initially felt overwhelmed and then started with an Inner Gold system and it worked for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could spend an hour telling stories about different individuals, and that could be a webinar in and of itself. I'll talk to specifically about one who recently sent me a uh, a message about how they were doing. Hadn't talked to this client for quite a few months, as they had been in the process for quite a while. So this person would have started maybe 4 years ago or so, and when they initially started the process, they were looking at pornography most of the time on a daily basis. Their life was basically centered around when they could have that next addictive feeding, so to say. A lot of secretiveness. Some days it would be hours on end. Some days multiple times masturbating. It was like, when can I get home from work to look at porn? You know, when can I sneak to look at porn? They were just at that highly, highly dependent addictive state. And when they first started talking, they literally were defeated. They didn't feel like it was possible. They were experiencing deep shame, a lot of regret. They didn't feel like it was possible for them to be loved by anyone because of their secret life that they were leading, and just a lot of negative emotions. And those of you who have gone through this addiction, and even if it's not to that level, you kind of understand those emotions. And he literally, when he started going through the process, he would say, I just don't feel like I'm making any progress. I'm doing what you're saying. I'm going through the system. But he was so deeply addicted that he wasn't feeling a lot of hope for a time. He stayed engaged, however. He trusted the process that has been put together. And this is the thing. When we're not honest about the process of recovery, that leads to more shame down the road. And so what he was experiencing was doing the hard work. He did his moral inventory. He went through the assignments. He stayed dedicated. He was daily planning out his time. Yet he was still having some slips and relapses. But what happened is, over time, he stayed so engaged. He started doing active meditation, like we talk about, identifying every trigger and really working through this process. And what happened is, initially, he felt like there was no way that this was ever going to improve. But after about 6 to 12 months of staying engaged, he really started noticing those differences in the way he was thinking and the way his brain was reacting to the triggers. And that's the thing, is, as we exercise that prefrontal, that neocortex, that starts creating healthy sequences in reteaching it how to communicate in a healthy way and get back in the driver's seat, versus where in addiction, the limbic system, that midbrain, is the one making the decisions. And then it was about 18 months after he was starting to get a week of sobriety, then a couple weeks of sobriety, and he really started thriving. And I hadn't heard from him for like 12 months, and he contacted me and said, hey, by the way, I'm doing better than ever in my life. I've stayed engaged in the process on a daily basis. I've had some ups and downs, he says, but I'm not even counting days anymore. He says, I think I've been sober for about 6 or so months, and I'm moving forward, and I'm feeling great. And it was just really refreshing. And he says, and he even said in that message, he talked about how, he said, when I started, I felt there was no way that this was possible, but now that I look back, I am so grateful that I trusted your counsel in staying engaged in the process, because it really works. And I've heard that story time and time again, where individuals stay engaged, and over time, as they get really honest with themselves, they start finding that progress. For some, it happens sooner than others. Doesn't mean it has to take 2 or 3 years, but sometimes you have to stay engaged for that long when the addiction has housed itself that deeply. And what people are often looking for is that cure. And I just recently shot a video about this, and they want that quick fix, that easy solution. They'll hear something that really resonates with them. They'll get a couple of weeks of sobriety, or even a couple of months, because they finally found like they've grasped that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and then they'll have a slip, and then they'll feel so defeated because, well, I must be a piece of junk because, this is the cure, and I'm probably the only person who it didn't work for. So those of you who have experienced this addiction know what that emotion is like, to feel so much shame when you feel like you should be better, but you've had a relapse and you feel like giving up because the noise around you says, I should be better. So what we're saying is, yes, you can get sober. You can achieve long-term sobriety, but it's through a process. It's through consistent living of daily steps that help retrain your brain and give you the mental fortitude and ability to really process in a healthy way those triggers and those deep-rooted addictive sequences that have housed themselves in your brain. And so to surrender to that fact is very powerful. And people will argue with me, and they still do to this day. It's like, oh, it's, you're saying that people have to go through this long process, and that's not always true. Well, whether that's true or not, the fact is you still have to go through a process. Whether it takes you a couple months to achieve long-term sobriety or a couple years, it's still a process. And if someone's achieved sobriety sooner than others, it's because they've surrendered to that fact that they have to stay constantly vigilant and integrate certain principles and tools, work through their shame, work through their inadequacies, sometimes work even deeper through a therapist or a counselor, And for some people, the online stuff is a great starting point, but might not even be enough. And so we're honest about that with our online users. We're not here to paint some picture so that 6 months down the road you're feeling like a piece of junk because you're not all the way magically healed. And I'm right, because those of you who are listening to this call who have gone through this addiction and who are experiencing this addiction, who have tried multiple things, and felt that failure over and over again, understand that working through that shame and kind of admitting that surrender place and being accountable to your relapses and learning from each one but not giving up on yourself really is where true sobriety and healing takes place. So a little bit of a lull here. Do we have, Tony, are you there with another question? Are you on mute, Tony? So I'm going to jump real quick. I have a bunch of questions right here on our Twitter page, so let me go to a question here. How can I best support my husband in recovery? So let me talk about that one for a minute. So while we're waiting for Tony to get back, it's interesting because spouses go through so many different emotions. I actually had a therapist call me today seeking some counsel. They said, I met with this couple and they were really kind of positive, and the reason why they ended up coming in for pornography addiction is the wife of this addict was like, hey, if you had read an article, if you ever experience this, I'm here to support you through this. And that kind of gave courage to the husband to kind of come clean with his addiction that he had never talked to her about. And this therapist called me and said, is this normal for this couple to be so connected and engaged in this process? And I said, yeah. And this therapist said, it's kind of weird because I've had so many couples come in where it's tons of anger and hurt and pain and resentment, which is also, for so many, part of the process. So as far as a wife with a husband or a husband with a wife with this addiction, because it's not just husbands with this addiction, it's also wives sometimes. But in supporting your spouse, I would say one of the most important things to do is to really honestly assess where you are. To put the frustration, the feelings of inadequacy, the feelings of hurt, of shame, of mistrust, those are still there, but put them to the side for just a minute, not permanently, but just for a minute, and think to yourselves, what is it that is affecting me? What is it that I need to work on if I'm really going to be a support here? And it might be something as difficult as, I don't feel like I deserve this. I didn't ask for this. I didn't create this problem. This is their issue, so why do I have to go through it? For some, that's one of the first areas for them to go, is to realize, you know what? It's not your fault. It really isn't your addiction, and it's not your fault. But being in a place to engage with that individual that you are trying to help, that you want so desperately to get on top of this addiction, that's sometimes the place to start. For others, it's simply having someone to talk through, that's in a healthy place. If you talk to someone's like, well, leave him right now, just get rid of the problem by leaving right now, right this second. That's not always the best advice, because perhaps the person you're with is really wanting to work through this addiction, and they just feel that they don't have any support. So being in that place where you don't feel like you have the strength to be that person, that's sometimes the place to start. So start where you're at, and don't beat yourself up if you're not that perfect spouse who's just ready to jump in and be compassionate, because you have a healing process to go through as well, no matter where you're at in that process. I've had spouses who are literally on that brink of tears every day for a couple weeks and even a month and 2 months, not wanting to eat, not being able to even get through the day without just falling apart because of the pain they're experiencing. So I would ask you, what's that about? Is that about how much you love that individual? Is that about how much it hurts to know that there's been the secret? Is that about feeling that you're not good enough or that you're not adequate enough? To be able to engage in your own emotions and to surrender to your own emotions is part of the process of healing. And I would pose, what couple doesn't go through some level of trauma in their marriage or their relationship? The definition, in my opinion, of a happy marriage is learning to get through painful things together. Now, that doesn't mean that every single spouse of an addict should make that decision. That doesn't mean that the right decision for them is to suffer through 20 years of addiction. That has to be a decision you make. I have seen couples make amazing progress and even be stronger than ever before as they get honest and congruent with each other. It's a hard process. And I've seen other couples where the addict just doesn't want to engage in any kind of a process, and they're basically put their head in the sand, and they don't want to go through any healing process. And that's really a personal decision for each one to make. I encourage people to not make their decision quickly, but to give it some time and process through your emotions before making any decision, whether you stay with someone or not, just etc. Yes,
all right,
Tony.
Rob, we've got a bunch of questions here. So,
okay, great.
when you say you're sober, does this mean that no slip-ups?
Yeah, I mean, we work with clients who do get to the point where they don't have slip-ups. And what's the definition of a slip-up? If a slip-up is like relapsing into full-on pornography, or is a slip-up, that I allowed myself to dwell on a pornographic thought for a half an hour. Different individuals are at a different place in their process. But it's like the further we progress, the more we stay engaged in the process of recovery, the stronger you become in recognizing triggers earlier and earlier and being accountable to where, let me tell a quick story. A client who was working with her husband, she was an addict. She was working with her husband. They had been making amazing progress. She had been sober for quite some time, and they had made a commitment to each other that one of her triggers was getting emotionally engaged in late night activities, specifically through media and television. She'd watch a drama on TV after her husband had gone to bed, and she'd get super triggered and feel lonely and want that emotional connection because he was working so much. And then she would go into this place where her brain would just shut off, and then she'd go into a full pornography relapse, oftentimes seeking out relationships on the internet. And this had been devastating to their relationship. They'd gone through a healing process. And here's what she considered a slip. She was at the point where she had made a commitment with her husband that I will not watch TV after 10 o'clock unless it's with you. And one night she was watching TV. There was a show on. It wasn't anything that was triggering her. She wasn't even triggered, but she watched TV till about 11. She wasn't even really thinking about it from a triggering perspective. But then she went upstairs and she realized, I just watched TV till 11. I had committed to my husband that I'd only watch it till 10. She wakes up her husband and she says, I had a slip. And he's like, what? What happened? And she says, I didn't follow through with my commitment. I watched TV for an hour past my committed time. And he's like, so you didn't slip? And she's like, no, I slipped. And he's like, no, you didn't. You didn't do anything wrong. And she's like, no, I did. I chose not to follow through with that commitment, which is why I'm being accountable to you. And then it clicked for him. He's like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And he says, and this client talked about, that's why I'm staying sober, is because I'm being that accountable that early on in the process of being triggered. And had I let that hour go, then I might have started watching TV every night till 11 for the next month, and I might have not have slipped that month or the next month, but eventually I would have slipped again into a full relapse because that was her cycle. So learning to identify your cycle, being honest and accountable to yourself, and finding ways to get further and further away in a healthy way from that relapse cycle is kind of what this process is about and what we help guide you through in this system.
There's a lot of good information out there, but frankly I get bored trying to read and do everything. Is there, and I find myself switching back and forth between taxes. He wants to know, is there anything that is like an absolute set mandatory things that I should be doing no matter what?
Yeah, absolutely. If I'm going to make a list, let me do that real quick. Getting to the place where every day you are making a plan. I can't remember the exact quote by Victor Hugo, but he talks about where it's in the Inner Gold system. It's one of the first quotes that you're introduced to, and it talks about where no plan is laid, where the disposal of time is just given to the chance of incidents. Like we don't plan anything out. Chaos will soon reign. Meaning where we don't have a plan, chaos will reign. So one of the first things, if you can get used to doing this on a daily basis, plan out your time. So I've had clients that are like, I play video games 8 hours a day. They have co-addictions and they might be addicted to gaming. And I'm like, then make that part of your plan. Write it down. Put it in your phone that you're going to play video games for 8 hours a day. Where in that 8 hours is using pornography part of the plan? Well, nowhere. Okay, but if you don't plan it out, you've just given your limbic system permission to take a break for an hour and relapse because you don't have a plan. And that doesn't guarantee sobriety, but the more you do that consistently, and I told you that story about that gentleman who I was referring to in my first story who had struggled for years and every day just relapsing. That was one thing that he said was the most effective for him, is creating that daily plan and holding himself accountable. And then when he messed up on that plan or didn't follow through with something, he held himself accountable. Didn't beat himself up for it, but he learned lessons. And that's one part of planning, is what lessons have you learned each day? When I do some of my daily plans, one thing that I had the other day is I plan too much. I want to do too much in my day, and so I'll often feel discouraged and disappointed because I didn't follow through with everything. So my lesson is I need to simplify my day. I need to plan less. I need to slow down so that I can be more effective in the things that I do. Meditation, taking time to slow down your mind, to think less thoughts, to calm down the chaos, has been so prevalently researched as one of the most effective tools in healing actual matter in the brain. So what happens with addiction is it actually breaks down the brain. And there's studies out there, we'll have to post some of them at some point. There are studies out there that show that different addictions, cocaine, sex addictions, heroin, actually atrophies or break down matter in the brain. But when we meditate, it helps engage the neuroplasticity of the brain, or its healing properties, because it helps it slow down. And it's like lifting weights. When you meditate, you are lifting brain weights. And clients will often say, it's one of the hardest things to do. Well, yeah, because you're teaching your brain to slow down and to think in a healthy way. And the limbic system fights against that because it wants to stay in the pattern of addiction. So when we do something to strengthen the brain, there will often be a conflict with that behavior. And so you can rest assured that, yeah, it's difficult to start meditating, but super important. And we already talked about accountability, finding ways to be accountable on a daily basis. So those are definitely some of those tangible things that you can be doing. Engaging your brain in healthy ways, having a time where you sit down and read and engage your prefrontal cortex, meditating, planning out your day, being accountable at the end of each day. So clients will often say, well, I relapse, so I don't feel like, I feel like I have to start over. No, if you've had a relapse, you're accountable for that, not beating yourself up, but saying, what have I learned from this relapse? Where did it start? Where could I have walked away? What can I do better in the future, et cetera, et cetera. Hope that helps.
What are some of the best coping mechanisms for newly recovering addicts?
Best coping mechanisms. That's a very
Again, this is a
personalized
for all
question.
those who are new to these calls. These are not scripted. These come.
Yeah, I don't know what questions are coming. I just answer these on the fly. I've spent so much time with addicts. I've seen that beginning to end process. And so when I have a client come into my office, I will generally, have to sit down with them and talk with them for a couple hours to find out their history, find out where their triggers are, because what triggers one person isn't going to trigger another person. So the first step of the process is to become educated, to learn, to understand this addiction, to really get a grasp on what it's all about. And there's so much available online that you can do with that. And this treatment system that we offer, that's what a large part of the initial modules are all about, is educating you on how the brain works, how the addiction works, identifying your triggers. So feel free to go to the Inner Gold 1000. Just search that in YouTube, Inner Gold 1000. 1000 as the number, and watch some of those videos. Learn about the two-part brain. Really engage yourself in becoming educated in this process. If there's one thing you can do to start this, is to accept that you have an addiction and educate yourself on what that addiction is all about. Because once we're educated, then we can start making decisions on what we need to do to get honest and start moving forward in healing.
How does the shame originate after acting out?
Oh my gosh, that's a fantastic question. That's a fantastic question. I wish I could draw this out on a whiteboard. One of these times I'll have to do that. So the limbic system essentially has the 3 prime directives: survival, avoid pain, seek pleasure. And that part of our brain that triggers the avoidance of pain and survival is largely and oftentimes based off of our emotions, or what we call the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of the emotional factory of the limbic system. And then what happens in our brain is the amygdala has, where every part of our limbic system has literally millions upon billions of connections with other parts of the brain. It's working together like a concert. And so this limbic part of the brain, the survival and avoidance of pain part of the brain, is connected to the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical part of the brain. So, for example, if a lion were to kill a gazelle and eat it, wouldn't feel any shame, because a lion does not have the ability to process any emotions. A lion has a limbic system, not the exact same as human beings, but a lion does have a need to survive, avoid pain, and it's going to eat a gazelle because that's what's pleasurable to it, or a deer, or whatever the, probably not a deer. I don't know if lions exist where there's deers. I'm not a geography specialist, but that lion's going to find that pleasurable food. It's not going to feel any guilt, not any shame, because there's no connection to a prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the processing part of the brain. So the brain has these value systems where it processes the emotions of what's taking place. So when we engage in a behavior that doesn't match our value system, then there's a discrepancy there. It's non-autonomous at that moment. And when we don't experience that autonomy, or that I'm living in accordance with my values and beliefs, there's chaos that's created, new emotions, and that primary emotion is, generally speaking, for almost every human being, they experience shame. And that's kind of where it originates. It's that communication between the amygdala and the prefrontal that says, oh my gosh, I've just done something that's not in accordance with my value system. Combine that, and there's another piece to this. When we use, we're getting a flood of dopamine, a flood of adrenaline, a flood of serotonin, a flood of oxytocin. We're getting a flood of chemicals through that chemical factory in our brain. It's like this explosion of pleasure. It's that orgasmic state of pleasure that takes place, but there's nothing to connect it to. That oxytocin, that connection chemical, which is what oxytocin is, it connects us in our relationships. It literally is like it falls off of a cliff and you feel this emptiness. And that also translates into a ton of shame, because it's like, whoa, by nature I'm a sexual being. By nature my oxytocin release is reaching for another human being and it's not finding anyone. The brain's being tricked into thinking it's creating a connection with the pornography, but it's a facade. It's the mirage of connection. And that mirage is like, it's like you've been thirsting in the desert, you get to the water and you're like, it's just sand. And it's almost like, for those who have had a relapse, they feel like they've just sucked up all of the sand thinking it was water, and then they feel like junk. And that's often where that shame originates. And combine that with value systems. You know, for example, if I've learned my whole life that I shouldn't masturbate or look at pornography, and then I'm participating in the natural emotions combined with the nature. So combined with the nurture emotions. So natural emotions are going to be there. We've had people who are atheists that say, you know what, I feel that drop off. When I masturbate or look at pornography, I don't feel whole. I feel kind of this emptiness. Well, that's not a religious statement. But let's add the value systems to that. Let's say we have a religious system or a Christian or Muslim or Judaistic religious statement that says I should forego these behaviors in my life outside of marriage, for example. The brain is going to make that connection, and it's going to create a lot of shame inside if we haven't learned the techniques and the ways to process through that shame. And so often where that gets to is, what's shame? Shame is I suck, I'm not good enough, I'm a piece of junk, I'm never going to get better, I'm a disappointment to my spouse, I'm a disappointment to my girlfriend or my boyfriend, or whatever that internalized kind of devastating personalized message that we push within ourselves through shame is. And one of the most effective things that addicts can learn how to do, and I would ask, how does shame help? I mean, if you're calling yourself a piece of junk or a piece of crap for having acted out on these behaviors, what good is that going to do you? In fact, nothing. What it is going to do is go back into the limbic system and say, this is painful, I'm feeling so much of this shame that I need to participate in some type of addictive or excess behavior so that I stop feeling the shame because I'm a piece of crap, which eventually will lead back to another relapse in pornography. Because what way does the limbic system know how to get the greatest amount of pleasure? Binging in porn. And then it feels shame. Then it wants to binge in porn. Then it feels more shame. Then it wants to binge in porn. Until what shame does is it starts to numb the limbic system's connection with the prefrontal cortex to the point where someone's so exhausted of feeling so junky about themselves that the limbic system will, from a survival mechanism, will often turn off the ability for the prefrontal to identify with emotion. And I have clients come in, they're like, how can I feel emotion again? And I say, engage in the process. Well, once they start feeling emotion again, they're like, wait, I don't want to feel emotion. And it's like, well, that's what this healing process is about. It's about learning to identify emotion and then go to a healthier place, which is what we call guilt. Guilt is the antithesis of shame. Shame says, I am the mistake. I am a terrible person. Guilt says, I made a mistake. What can I do better?
Hey, Rob, as you're going on this vein, they want to know, how do you process shame?
Different for everybody. I mean, for some people, that's going back to that place of childhood where you hear your parents' voice saying, you're not good enough. Or you hear perhaps an ecclesiastical leader saying you'll never match up. Or you hear a teacher in school saying, you'll never amount to anything. Shame is that place of failure where we give up as a human being in certain things that we're trying to engage in. Shame is, well, once you're beaten down, stay down because you stink. And how it originates for every person is different. And so identifying where it kind of originates can be a painful process sometimes. I'll do family therapy, and I'll have entire families come in, and none of them want to talk about anything personal. That by nature is the definition of shame. A family that throws, and some of you are probably smiling because you're like, oh, that's my family. You learn to throw every issue under the carpet and not deal with it. That's because of shame. So learning how to engage in the issues in an honest way and finding people that you can engage with that aren't going to beat you up or shame you, that will truly empathize with you. I would strongly encourage you to YouTube Brené Brown, BreneBrown, and watch her TED Talk on shame. Okay? And yeah, loss, oh my gosh, one addict that I knew, he had lost a daughter in a tragic accident, and he started using prescription meds to numb his pain for a year because he was so ashamed of the things he had done wrong as a father, that he hadn't loved his daughter more, that he hadn't been there, and so he just didn't want to grieve all of those things, and so he ran from it because of his shame. A year later, he got arrested for stealing pain prescription medications and had to go to jail and through a recovery program. And one thing he said is, now that I've been sober for a few months, I am so grateful to experience the pain of grief and loss, because the pain I felt in my addiction far surpassed what I'm feeling now. And now I'm healing, and it's amazing. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's that two-edged sword. I want to numb my pain, but when we learn to lean into that pain, to embrace those places of shame and acknowledge those, and then start translating those into, okay, can I control this? Let's say my shame is, I was a father, and now I have an adult child who I just never connected with, and I could have done a way better job. And so I'm feeling shame as a parent, and shame as a human being, and I stink as a dad. How do I work through that shame? Well, I get accountable with it. I go to that child. I talk through it with them. I say, you know what? I'm feeling like a crappy dad, and I'm sorry for the things that I did wrong, and I really want to try to do better. And I know you might not be ready to repair that relationship with me, but I'm here for you. That is a tough place to go. It's going to bring up stuff. It's going to put you into a maybe even a tougher place for a while, but it will heal. So here's a trick. If it's going to create some short-term pain due to honesty and accountability, it will ultimately create long-term success and contribute to long-term sobriety. Okay? If it's going to create short-term pleasure by numbing the pain, it will generally lead to more long-term pain and long-term relapses. So short-term pain, long-term success. Short-term pleasure usually means long-term consequences. You can apply that to eating. Short-term Big Mac, long-term overweight. Short-term healthy food, long-term healthy body, right? and that's really a good mechanism to use in saying, is this something I should process through? Will it be difficult to process through this thing? Yes, but it's going to create long-term results. Sometimes you'll want to talk to a therapist even if you're in really deep shame spaces. Like, let's say you've been through sexual abuse. You should process that with a therapist who knows their stuff, okay? If you need brain surgery, don't go to someone who is a foot surgeon, right? Same thing with therapy. Find someone who knows how to work through sexual trauma before you go into a therapist. So I hope that's helpful to you in regards to shaming and guilt and the difference and where to go.
Their response was, wow. So
good. And let me add this. To those of you who are connected right now and hearing this, I have a belief system. I don't know if this is your belief system or not, but I have a belief system that every single human being is worthy of love. That's something I learned through studying Brene Brown. It's something that I believe in my life. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do and why I'm trying to get this information out to thousands of people, because we are all worthy of love. And when we can start believing that about ourselves, that's a huge key in getting through shame. Oh, but I've slipped so many times and I've done so many terrible things. How could I ever be worthy of love? Well, I mean, you are. If you're a Christian, I don't know anywhere in Christian theology where the Christ figure shamed individuals. He was always there forgiving them, helping them process, helping them be accountable, loving them. And, it's very similar in other religious theologies, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's, Judaism, that we are a people that are worthy of love. We all have our junk. We all have our issues. We have all been through stuff that we regret and that we wish we could change, but we just can't. The difference between those who stay in addiction and those who begin to really move forward are those who can embrace those mistakes and still love themselves and learn to move past those, rather than living in that past and tripping over those mistakes over and over again.
Rob has a quote that I really like, and it says, "My junk stinks," because everybody has junk and it always stinks. So don't worry about it. We all have our issues.
Yeah, well, I would say it's not so much as don't worry about it, because we're human. We do worry about it. But learning how to look at that and say, okay, what can I learn from this? I had a client say something along the lines of, I just need to be easier on myself. And I'm like, what does that mean? And he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, what does that mean to be easier on yourself? I don't know. Because that in and of itself is a shame statement, meaning, well, I shouldn't, I need to be easier on myself because I feel so much shame. A guilt statement would say, it's not necessarily about being easier on yourself. It's about being, when you're not easy on yourself, to do it in healthy, accountable ways. If I've been showing up for work an hour late every day and I'm feeling shame because of that, should I be easier on myself? No. I should be guilty in a healthy way and be accountable to that and start taking steps that will put me in a direction where I'm on time for work. It's not necessarily about being easy on ourselves. It's about not beating ourselves up. And so we're spending more energy on accountability and action versus wallowing in our shame and feeling like pieces of junk, which, by the way, if you can do that perfectly, I'd love to meet you and give you a medal, because I don't know a single person who can do it perfectly. we all have our shame spaces. I do. I know Tony does. We all do as human beings. And it's just a process of learning to get better and better at that.
Okay, I'm just processing here. It's kind of a long question.
Who's our own biggest critic? Or critic. Who's our own biggest critic? Ourselves. There is no greater critic that we have than ourselves. Think about that for a minute.
Okay, this summation of this question is, I'm a student. I have a hard time studying because of this addiction. I feel like it makes me feel weak in understanding and remembering my study notes. Is this an actuality?
Yes. Yeah. This is, we often want to look at addiction and try to find ways around it. The fact is addiction is addiction, and it creates chaos in the brain. On the other side, learning to get sober is beautiful. It creates clarity. It creates so much more energy. Addiction just drains the body of energy. When we experience stress and anxiety and shame, our body is producing cortisol. I believe that's what it's called. If I'm wrong, I'll have to go on and repair my statement. I'm not perfect in my statements either, so don't quote me on these things if I'm off. But cortisol is released in our body as a chemical that is actually meant to try to heal our bodies in a way, but when we produce too much cortisol, it actually breaks down our body, and it can result in less immune function. It can actually start breaking down cellular structure. And so when someone's relapsing or using their drug of choice, whether it's anything that just wreaks havoc to the dopamine receptors and adrenal receptors, the body, it's going to go through that stress phase, whether it's through shame or just the body trying to repair itself. It's producing too much cortisol and it's breaking down the body, and it atrophies the brain. Some of the things I'm seeing here is it creates fogginess, high blood pressure, stress. Yeah, it does. And so being willing to admit that and not beat yourself up for it, but say, whoa, I need to do something about this. I need to start putting some systems in my life that will help me get on top of this. So important. So tip for you, college student or high school student, whoever you are, who's trying to find ways to focus. What environment are you studying in? If you're in a room alone with access to a laptop where you can binge on porn, your brain is always going to be going to the porn place. It's just like for me, if I'm sitting in a McDonald's trying to be on a diet, I am going to fail. I love Big Macs, right? And I'm going to eat them, or I'm going to go grab a McRib because it's that special time of the year where we can eat processed food that's higher calories than any other time of the year. I am going to relapse in that if I'm putting myself in those environments. So if your slip place, if your relapse place is where you're studying, good luck. Your brain is going to be foggy. So go to a library around other people. Give yourself an hour. Give yourself 15-minute breaks, because your brain might not be in a place where it can go on a study binge for 6 straight hours. Study for a half hour. Give yourself a 5-minute break in a library. That's one thing I learned in college is I did my best when I got out of my apartment. And I got my rear end to the library, and I learned to study in very directed, planned out increments. I started nailing it. I started killing it in college, getting A's in everything when I learned that principle.
How do I, as a wife, get my husband to see his great worth in the midst of this addiction? He's having a hard time having hope and is feeling like he is a lesser of a man because of it.
You know what? I mean, thank you for that comment. What a fabulous person you are. I don't blame spouses that don't even want to go there with their addicted spouse because of the pain that they sometimes feel. But I so commend you for asking those kind of questions. And I encourage spouses, if possible, to try to get to that space where they're willing to ask these kind of questions. It's a process for the addict. They've usually, their addiction is usually a manifestation of their shame. Rarely, if ever, does a pornography addiction have to do with the spouse. It's not your fault. It's not your addiction. It's not because you're not beautiful enough or look good enough. It's not because there's not enough sex. It's because it's an addiction. It'd be like someone saying, if I was better, my spouse wouldn't use heroin. If I was better, my spouse wouldn't use porn. No, an addiction is an addiction that's a coping mechanism for shame, for whatever other emotion they're experiencing. Now, the power that you carry as a spouse is being able to go through your process, and it sounds like you've done a lot of work, or you're just in a really good place in your life where you're willing to be there for your spouse and learning the keys of empathy, learning to let them know that you are not going anywhere, that you're going to be there for them, whether they relapse, whether they're honest with you, whether they're not, will really be a powerful, it's almost like taking on almost like a savior type of a role to teach them that principle of unconditional love. And when someone is loved so unconditionally, it kind of forces them to work through their own shame, because it's not any longer, they can't make excuses. They can't say, if I was less lonely or more loved. They have to really face up to their addiction and say, this is about me. I've got to take accountability, and I've got to work through my junk, because my spouse loves me and they're not going to shame me. And that's such a powerful place. You can't fix their addiction. You could monitor all their technology devices and look through their phone and spy on them or whatever you want to do. Well, you might catch them, but it's not going to fix anything, and they're just going to feel more shame. So just being there, learning more about empathy. Again, I keep referring to Brené Brown. She's great. Watch her short video on shame versus sympathy. Fantastic. Shame is just being able to be with someone in their dark space and imagining what it's like for them. Not saying, I know how you feel, because you might not know how they feel, but saying, I'm here for you. Thank you for sharing. I'm here for you.
Okay,
Also,
everybody, just want to let you know it's almost 8 o'clock. And
holy cow, I'm rambling. Sorry, guys.
We have 1 hour that we do this for, and we don't want to take up too much time. I have 7 children, and Rob has 6.
Yeah.
So
and they've been good. I threatened them that if they came upstairs, that they wouldn't get. I probably used terrible behavioral therapy on them. I'm bribing them. So.
Candy always works, unfortunately. We're gonna only take a few more questions, and
I'll rip through them too. Let's get through these.
What are the most common mistakes addicts make that impede their recovery?
Thinking that the small things don't matter.
Maybe you could expand on that just a bit more.
Well, I'm not planning on looking at porn, but, I'm going to do this,
Would this be kind of like walking in the store and taking a little longer look at the magazines, but...
Right, not being accountable to the small things.
Okay.
Triggers take time to process through the brain, even on a subconscious level. So it usually creates multiple sequences through the limbic system for it to shut off the prefrontal cortex. And that's what's happening in a relapse, is the limbic system is shutting off that value system part of our brain temporarily. Then once you're done relapsing, that value part of your brain turns back on. Then you start feeling shame and all those negative emotions. So learning how to be accountable very, very at the beginning of that relapse cycle. Identifying, well, I'm feeling lonely right now. I haven't done anything. I haven't gone online. But I'm feeling lonely. Okay, I'm going to call a friend. I think we have a document that we're going to post that Tony was showing me earlier. What's that called, Tony, again?
Are you referring to the protocol?
Wave?
The wave protocol sequence?
Yeah, the wave protocol sequence. I'm not sure if that's only available in the system or whether it's a free tool, but having things in place that you can do when you start feeling those emotions. The small things right at the beginning. I'm feeling lonely, I'm going to call up my friend. Versus I'm feeling lonely, I'm going to go watch TV for 4 hours, feel like a piece of crap, stay depressed, and then relapse in about 1 or 2 hours or 1 or 2 days or whatever it is.
I enjoy Rob answering his questions because he just kind of doesn't beat around the bush and just brings his witty sense of humor. It's great. Okay, looks like we still have time for 2 more questions. Do any of these online brain training sites produce good results? What about just playing a musical instrument?
Yeah, anything that's engaging your prefrontal cortex is good. Whether you're involved in 1 online system or 3, stay involved. Stay engaged in the process. If you're using an online system that says there's an end game, like you're graduated, you're all better, you're not using the right system. That's the one thing I'll state. If it's a system that teaches you principles to stay engaged, stuff that you can integrate through a lifetime that will improve your life, not just in pornography addiction, but across the board, that's great. So brain training stuff, fantastic. Why not? I highly encourage that. Just like meditation. If it's helping you meditate, use it. It's going to strengthen your brain. It might not be fun, but it's very applicable to recovery, sure.
I personally do a lot of motivational listening, and one of my favorites is Zig Ziglar. And on YouTube there have
Zig
one
is
called Reach to the Top. I encourage everybody to just listen to that because he's a good man who just has some good solid principles, especially on goal setting and other things. Okay, excuse me. Can the prefrontal cortex stay turned off continually? For how long?
I don't have a definitive answer to that. I suppose atrophy could be so bad with an addiction after, if someone was like using heroin 100 times a day, if they hadn't died, they might get so brain damaged from it that maybe. But no, the prefrontal this is the funny thing is addicts will go through these phases where they're like, this time I'm not going to feel guilt or shame. This time I'm going to stay in the addiction and not feel that way afterwards. Right. You all know I'm right with this. Eventually, even if you get like a week into a relapse or a month into a relapse, it's going to start eating away at you, and your prefrontal is going to say, hey, listen, quick principle. Our limbic systems are like 5-year-olds. If a 5-year-old says, I'm going to eat this whole jar of candy and I'm not going to feel any tummy ache for it, eventually they're going to feel a tummy ache. And the limbic system is going to start shouting to the prefrontal cortex and saying, will you help me stop, because I'm going to keep throwing up if I don't stop eating candy. And it's the same thing with pornography addiction. Eventually that prefrontal cortex is going to try to reason with the limbic system. And it's funny because the limbic system is like saying, please help me survive by stopping this addiction. And then the limbic system is also saying, you better not help me stop this addiction because it's helping me survive. The limbic system is not meant to, the limbic system is just trying to survive. And it's ambiguous. It wants the best of both worlds. That's the prefrontal's job, is to help the limbic system know what's healthy. Foregoing that jar of candy right now might be hard for the 5-year-old, but the benefits will be no tummy ache and no throwing up after if they binge.
Okay, well, I think that's going to be our last question. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming on and asking your questions. We will be doing this again on December 10th. That's right, we'll be doing this again December 10th, and most likely, I believe Rob will be answering then as well. But
looking forward to it.
Rob, any closing remarks?
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. You are all amazing people. Just the fact that you're here listening, whether you're a family member, a spouse, an addict, whatever you're going through, thank you so much for engaging in this process, and we encourage you to not give up, to keep moving forward, to pick yourself up when you fall, and to continue loving those around you who do struggle with addiction, because they do need your help, and you are honored for being a support to others around you. So thank you.
Okay, everybody, thank you again. We look forward to talking to you on December 10th. Have a great night.
Thanks.